Well, as a mother and a woman, do you believe that you had easier access to interviews, or that you brought a much different perspective? Certainly I know as a mother, but even in your interview with Sharon.
Yeah. I think in the Middle East in general, and this goes all the way back to Pakistan and Afghanistan, where we would have to cover up and wear the chador if you wanted certain interviews with certain people, and you know, when I was interviewing the former spiritual head of Hamas, you know, I'd have to wear a headscarf, and Sheikh Yassin, who eventually was killed. I think that there was something about many of the men in the Middle East who underestimated a female reporter who came to them, and their guard was maybe down, and they were less guarded, and I was invited into many homes that I don't think Greg or other male reporters would have been embraced in quite the same way that I was. And so and when I would show up pregnant at times, there was a softening of maybe the hardened stance or of some of these leaders of groups that I was trying to sort of crack or understand what was motivating them. And there was a real openness in terms of how they wanted to spend time and explain what their point of view and what they were fighting for, or whatever they were doing, so I felt like it was kind of an icebreaker, frankly, being a mother in that situation in the Middle East, and I think it did work to my advantage in terms of being able to get interviews that maybe you wouldn't otherwise get. Certainly, if you're in Afghanistan, you're not going to have access to half of the population if you're a male reporter, because you can't go in, if the women are in Purda, you can't go in and, as a male outside the family, and interview women. So I immediately had access to more people in those areas. In the Palestinian areas, you didn't have such strict division in terms of people keeping Purda, but I do feel like both Palestinians and Israelis, there was a softening that took place, and a friendship and a camaraderie, if you will, because family was so important to Palestinians and Israelis. They had large families for the most part, and there was sometimes either side could be very suspicious of journalists, or feel that journalists were just there and that they wouldn't understand their story, and so why bother talking to them. And I think that when they saw that I had young children, or that I was pregnant at the time, there was much more time given, and access, and kind of a human relationship that emerged from those interviews.
Was there one particular interview that you thought was a major coup?
There were a lot of coups, but some of them were less the big name people. I mean, everyone always asks, who was the most amazing, interesting world leader that you've interviewed? Well, I've never found world leaders very interesting. I think it's the individuals in these people, no-name people that you would never have heard of before, who struck me the most. I remember one incident, actually, a Hamas leader in Bethlehem who I had gotten to know, who again, I went to him during Ramadan, and he had me to his house for iftar, which was to break the fast that night, and he knew I had a small daughter back in Jerusalem, and at that time, the Israeli military had sealed off Bethlehem because bombers were coming from Bethlehem, and the fighting was intense, and so I was over in Bethlehem, which wasn't very far from my house in Jerusalem, but it wasn't very far physically, but psychologically it was a world away, and I was in this Hamas leader's house, and he always asked me, first he always went through and asked me about my family and how is my daughter, and then what was really blew my mind was after each bombing in Jerusalem, he would call me and say, is your family okay, Jennifer? I wanted to check on you, and I just felt this strange disconnect. It was this surreal phone call that I would receive, often late at night. Greg, we would get it at 11 at night, and it wasn't that this Hamas leader was a complicated figure. I don't believe he was sending bombers, and that it was not that sort of. It would have been much harder for me to, I think, receive that phone call if I felt that he had been sending a particular bomber, but he knew he was part of an organization that was sending those bombers, and I think he probably had some moral quandary with what was happening, and he would call, and it was this very unreal phone call, and then eventually he ended up in a prison camp outside Ramallah, and he would call from there and say, you know, make sure you explain my point of view and our point of view, and we would talk, but so those were the kind of characters that I met along the way that really affected me. Now, it's not to say that he changed my mind on suicide bombings, and he really didn't try, but it was strange to meet the human part of the, you know, often we paint these pictures of terrorists, if you will, and it was very strange to get to know the people and the individuals and the human beings who were part of this crazy situation that had evolved. And so there were quite a number. If I went through my address book, I would see a lot of marked out names from that time, because there were a lot of assassinations by Israeli, you know, helicopters who, because we were going, you know, from the early days of the Intifada, meeting with the leaders of Al-Aqsa brigades or Hamas or you know, other splinter groups in the territories, you would find that a lot of those names and numbers who were contacts and sources at a certain point, they no longer existed when we left, because there had been a lot of death and destruction by the time we left Israel.